Hi guys, I'm Reed, this is Crowland Publishing, and this is the introduction to a series of videos that we're going to do on world building and fantasy subgenres. Now, I'm primarily a fantasy guy. That's my love. I love swords and I love dragons and I love castles. That's my thing. But if I say to you fantasy, it's a huge big tent, and there are subgenres. These are sort of sets of concerns. These are themes, these are aesthetics, and they are not all the same. Because if I say fantasy, do I mean the lovely talking animals and cozy niceness of Narnia? Do I mean the leftist Victoriana steampunk of Baslag? Do I mean the Asian-influenced Empire series by Wirtz and Feist? Do I mean the hot barbaric action of a Bran McMorn novel? There's so many different ways to be a fantasy story, and each of them has their own specific concerns and their own specific needs when we talk about adapting them to a game. So I have discovered 5 different subgenres that I feel are really great for setting D&D games in, that have their specific strengths. The first up is Hyborian Fantasy. Named after the Conan settings, Barbarian Fantasy might be the first of all kinds of modern fantasy stories. It's set in a pre-classical world. Sometimes it's set in a post-apocalyptic world. Barbarian fantasy, Hyborian fantasy, is about humans versus the wild, about civilization versus barbarity. It's Nietzschean, it's about violence, it's about power, it's about strength. And a lot of the time it's also about high adventure. Conan stories are where the whole, I've heard about an idol, I want to go and steal it. It's in a tomb. There will be traps. That's Hyborian fantasy. Number 2 is medieval fantasy. And medieval fantasy is absolutely the easiest and perhaps best kind of fantasy that D&D emulates. You take a time period of roughly 1000 to about 1500 AD. Generally speaking, it's in Western Europe. And then you make that into a fantastic setting. It's very standard for a reason. And there's a lot of elements of that medieval period that people sort of don't really get into that are very gameable, like chivalry, like the role of violence in society, like religion, like courtly love, like the complicated politics of the era. There's a lot going on in medieval fantasy, and we will talk about it all. Swashbuckling fantasy is number 3. From musketeers to pirates, it's a subgenre of high adventure, intrigue, romance, lots of exciting set pieces, lots of villainous, mustache-twirling villains. Possibly my favorite kind of genre, but swashbuckling fantasy has a few specific needs that need to be addressed if you're going to play it in D&D. Number 4 is what we're going to call New Weird. Now, New Weird was an attempt to update some ideas from the 1920s and the 1930s, and also an attempt to really consciously break with a lot of the influences and ideas and tropes that had existed in fantasy since the 1960s, since Lord of the Rings. It's very sociological, it's very political, it's very much about now. It's very much about cool things that exist today, and have reflected back on us through complicated fantasy worlds. You'd be surprised how easily it works for D&D, and we're going to talk about it and really have a look at how to break away from the elves and dwarves. Number 5 is what we're going to call modern fantasy. Modern fantasy is interesting because it tends to come out of video games. It tends to sort of be a genre that has emerged from role-playing games themselves. It is an idea that somehow the fantasy world and the 21st century or science fictional worlds live together side by side. We're talking about stuff like Arcanum, sort of, Final Fantasy VII, Spelljammer, things where the modern world and the fantasy world, technology and magic collapse together. It's very interesting, it's very new, and we're going to have a lot to talk about. So there you go, 5 subgenres. I've got to tell you, I'm not too well at the moment. Have a look at my disability video for more. So this is going to come over the next few weeks. I hope you like it. I hope it's interesting. I'm excited to talk about it. This is the juice for me. This is what I really love to discuss. So come with me Next video, Hyborian era. Give us a like. See you later.